Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CMS Book Club. Today, we're going to talk about the book called Curious, The Desire to Know and Why Your Future Depends on It. And the author is Ian Leslie. So first, I'll give you a little overview of the book, get your reactions, and then ask you to share, what captivated you the most about the book, how it might relate to your experiences, what you found curious about it, what you may take from it, put into practice. Ancient Athens defined curiosity as the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, a passion of knowing. And being curious is having the curiosity, or being curious and having curiosity itself has been regarded over time as sort of a virtue, a vice, or a mixture of both. In the book, Ian explores our human nature to be curious, and in the introduction, he includes and highlights a way to assess our curiosity, our need for cognition, NFC, which is a measure of your intellectual curiosity, by answering a set of true-false questions. And then based on your answers, you may be scoring high or low in your need for curiosity, with a high NFC associated with more active seeking of information or experiences, and a low NFC being associated with being a cognitive miser, a really interesting concept, but one who is less apt to expend mental effort or question or seek new information or experiences. But even if you score high, curiosity is a state of mind, and it can be vulnerable to where you are, what your situation is, what your environment is, and it's very vulnerable to neglect. So as the book unfolds, the author discusses how and why our curiosity tends to fade with age, so sad, and yet how can we reignite it and help us excel in our personal and professional lives. The author shares a lot of stories, a myriad of stories, in the 3 parts and 8 chapters of the book, as he discusses various aspects of curiosity, our innate desire to know, our ability to ask why. And he discusses the story of the differences between the fox and the hedgehog, with the fox knowing many things or knowing a little about a lot, and the hedgehog who knows one big thing or knows a lot about a little, a very specific topic. And then finally, the book concludes with the author discussing 7 ways to stay curious, to help us keep our curiosity active, well-nourished, and hydrated, so to speak. And it'll be interesting to discuss among ourselves these 7 ways, which I'll highlight now. 1 is stay foolish and hungry. 2 is build the database of knowledge, or think, ponder, and bring it to life. 3, forage like a foxhog. 4, ask the big question, the notion of empathic curiosity and frames, I might add. Thinker, which is sort of a balance between being a thinker and a doer. Question your teaspoons, which is the notion of making the choice to learn and being curious about things around us, even the mundane. And turn puzzles into mysteries. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion.
Sure. So I'm Mary Fay, a nurse by training, and I'm currently the Associate Director for the Applied Learning for Performance and Safety Division of the Center for Medical Simulation. Of course, was interested in this book because it's called Curious, and I think if there's a commonality in a lot of the ideas and things we do at the Center for Medical Simulation, it's all about staying curious and being curious and expressing that curiosity. mostly within the context of our learners thinking, as I thought about like satisfying curious moments in my life, I kept going back to when I was working on my dissertation, and that it brings up the ways he describes curiosity in two ways. There's two types of curiosity. There's this diversive curiosity, which is the curiosity that drives us to things that are novel and new, and we want to see this new thing and do this new thing. And then there's epistemic curiosity, which is the curiosity that drives us to want to like go more deeply into a topic, but then get off on those cool tangents. You know, when you were doing like your literature review for your PhD and you'd be reading a paper and you would love this idea. So you would look at the reference that went with that, and then you would go and find that paper, and then it would lead you to something. And before you knew it, you were down this rabbit hole. But those rabbit holes were so great because you actually ended up learning about stuff you didn't even know you wanted to know about, that ended up informing the thing you actually did want to know about. And so I think, you know, to me, the difference between these two kinds of curiosities and how he describes it is that the diversive curiosity is the curiosity that makes us go after clickbait, that makes us doom scroll because we're just like looking for this next little squirt of dopamine in our brain. That's that kind of curiosity. And the epistemic curiosity is the curiosity that makes us go, gosh, what do I not know yet? You know, I kind of want to know more about that thing, but I'm so open to wanting to know more about a whole bunch of other things also. And it's that's the kind of curiosity that really requires concentration and effort. And that's not the trend in most people's use of the internet. To fill in gaps in our knowledge. You know, what is the XYZ? Go Google it and find out. I really liked his distinguishing the two different types of curiosity, and why both are time consuming. One is time consuming and not terribly productive, and the other one is time consuming, but actually enriches us. So I kind of liked that message in his book a lot.
Can I chime in as well? Grace Ng here, Senior Director for Faculty Development Programs at CMS. You know, I really echo a lot of things that Mary had just said. And I think at CMS, the notion of curiosity is so central to what we do. It's actually one of our core values, even though we don't, you know, make it extremely explicit when we interact with others. But I feel like for those people who've taken our courses or attended our workshop at conferences, you know, they can't leave our presence without hearing the word curiosity and experiencing what curiosity might look like at the moment. And I think the part about why do we need to be curious really resonated with me because it's so practical. To me, it's just makes so much more sense to be curious because it helps us solve problems. And a lot of times I actually find myself, you know, if I'm recognizing that I'm not curious, a lot of times I find myself coming to a dead end when I'm trying to solve a problem. But when I try to even infuse a little bit of curiosity and ask the question like, why is this thing done this way? Why did you choose this approach? Just opens up such a broad avenue for us to solve problems together. So for me, that practicality of curiosity just makes it so indispensable in our work as well.
Yeah, we do have it explicitly a few places. It is stitched on the CMS baseball caps. Be curious.
That is true.
So if you're wearing one of those around, it does say "Be curious" on the side of your head.
Yeah.
Lauren, I should wear mine.
You can tattoo it on my forehead.
Well, I confess, I was planning to wear it and I forgot to bring it from the office to home. Yeah, I started thinking about, you know, being a cognitive detective and, you know, how we use that throughout the healthcare simulation instructor course that we have. And then it sort of going down my own rabbit hole of experiences. I think probably Dan Raymer deserves some mention here because he is always such a curious about his surroundings. He, for me, was a big role model of figuring out ways to help my own self be more curious. And so reading this book really, I think I found it very satisfying, very illuminating, just thinking about the tensions of the various aspects to curiosity and striking that balance between, knowing and appreciating when you need to go deep and go down a particular rabbit hole, like the hedgehog, versus spanning back out and taking more of that 30,000-foot view. I think Dan Raymer is probably the quintessential form of curiosity.
I'm a little bit aware that, well, between Rox and I and the fellows, there's a bit of a generational divide. Grace and James fall somewhere there in the middle. But the content that was in this book, to you youngsters, Lauren and Ali and Will, one of the things in this book was about how the use of the internet is creating this, he called it a cognitive polarization. Because what they're finding is that a lot of people use the internet really just to like quickly get a question answered. Other people use the internet to really like go deep on a topic. And I'm really curious because I am not a digital native. I did not grow up in a generation. I did not have a computer in my house until I was probably in my 30s. And so for you young guys, what are your thoughts about how people in your generation use the internet to get questions answered? Is it like get in and get out real quick, get my question answered, move on? Or is it used to like dive deep? Would love to hear how you guys think about that.
I'm Lauren. I'm from Calgary, Canada, but currently in Boston as an OB anesthesia fellow. I was going to say both. And I think it goes back to sort of what he talks about in the book, in that, those two different sort of spectrums or types of curiosity. You have your, now I'm going to forget them, epistemic, and then diversive, I think was the other one. Yeah. I think it's, you can use it for both, and I use it for both. And I think that probably varies person to person in our generation and what sort of question they're trying to answer. But just to give an example, I'm preparing for a presentation, like a clinical presentation that I have to do on Friday. And it's, a medical topic. But I think as I'm diving deep into the medical topic, that diversive curiosity helps me think of, all these different things that I can add to the presentation to maybe make it more dynamic. And it does distract you a little bit from actually getting the work done. You go off on all these different tangents because it's all there at your fingertips on the internet. So I'm, thinking like, oh, how could I make it more interesting? I'll watch a YouTube on that. And then you go down that tangent. And, oh, how can I, incorporate, some aspects of sim and team building and shared mental models into dealing with this medical topic. And so then I go off on a tangent on that. All the while you're sort of adding and building into your understanding of the clinical picture. So I think I use it for both, and maybe it takes me longer to get through the project or presentation, compared to as if I was just looking it up in a textbook. But I think like it adds to my learning and to coloring, that clinical idea for me by being able to go off onto these tangents and look up different things simultaneously while I'm also diving deeper to the main topic. But I think it probably varies person to person.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren.
I would agree. I think the other element that we have to deal with when we're engaging in the internet as a medium is I feel like compared to other mediums, it's like one of the first mediums that fights back a little bit. It kind of directs your focus as you're moving through. And depending on who you are, what you previously looked at, it can also kind of guide that focus. So I think it's, at least when I initially started approaching it, I think it was more of exploratory. You get in, you answer a question, you get out. But now it's more assessing what I'm reading and taking some of what I'm reading with a grain of salt and reflecting on like, am I being influenced by unknown triggers that I'm not necessarily seeing? That's always something that I always have to reflect on as the medium changes.
That's such a great point, Will. Yeah. Ali?
My name is Ali Darraj. I'm a family physician and assistant professor from Saudi Arabia. I came as a fellow in Center for Medical Simulation. To answer your question, I think it depends on how we can use it. The internet will either make us smarter or cause our intelligence to decay. But it depends how we can use the internet based on two types of curiosity, which is the first one, diversive, and the other one is epistemic. The diversive, that we need to know something, we don't have anything before about it. The internet, in such case, it's very useful to us. But the second issue, when we talk about the curiosity epistemic, we need to go deep to know something. So in such case, the internet itself, it's not enough. We should go to the book to discuss with our colleague, with the expert, and we can take the internet as supportive only.
You know, Ali, you remind me of something he said in the book, and you said this when you opened your comments, like the internet can make us smarter or the internet can make us dumber. But in any case, don't blame the internet. It's all about the choices we make about how we want to use the internet. Yeah. I like that part of the book too. Yeah.
Mary, I'm gonna decamp myself here with the digital natives. Since I'm a millennial, I'm not even an elder millennial, I'm just a millennial. I do think, to the point about using the internet or like learning things from the internet, I don't know that I believe that speed of access to information is a meaningful predictor of retention. And if anytime people start to talk about this stuff, especially in literature, it does set off my pop psych alarms. And I was curious whether it was setting off some of those alarms for other people. It does set off my pop psychology alarms when those two things are linked a little bit. And this comes from, again, my background in education. Like, this is the classic Ebbinghaus memory retention curve. The way that you remember things is through reuse.
Right.
It's not about speed of access. That Ebbinghaus study is from 1884. It's not like it's new technology. This is when people were complaining about books because they taught people not to use a slate properly, right? It set off my pop psychology alarms when speed of access of information is associated with retention. Because for me, just as an example of like a fact that I frequently have to look up, I'm diabetic, and so I do carb counting in my meals. If I have a food that I just know what the carbohydrate ratio is, right? Like, I know that you take the gram weight of an onion and you multiply it by 0.06, right? Like, that's something I know because I cook onions in every single meal. But if I have to look up something like, what is it for strawberries, which I eat 2 times a year, if I used it more often, if I used that piece of information more often, I would retain it. It's not a question of how fast I'm able to access it. It's true that I don't have to worry about retaining it because I know I can find it again, but it still is faster to know. It's like, oh, potatoes are 0.17, right? Like, it's faster to just know that than to have to look it up every time. But really, it's about reuse over time that leads to retention. And that's like good data-driven science, that we know that that's how retention works. So.
Yeah, James, I do agree with that. I'm glad you brought it up because I was questioning myself for a little bit, where that came from. And I feel like it might be like a false dichotomy there. And, in disclosure, I'm like the tail end of Gen X, like an exennial person, and certainly had to go to the card catalogs and the library basement in my college to find those journal articles. And I have to say that, not from hard science or, concrete data, I feel like that in a way might have stifled curiosity because it's so hard to go to the card catalog and fight other students to find those journal articles. Once I found it, I'm like, I'm done. I'm not motivated to necessarily look for more. So I find that setup in a book pretty interesting, but curious to, hear a little bit more about it, perhaps in the future, if the author would, expand on that some more.
It really depends on like the question I'm trying to ask. I feel like if I'm asking like a simple recall question, then I'm more inclined to use like a voice command rather than if I'm trying to answer like a more complex or nuanced question. Then I feel like I need the ability to kind of formulate that out and type that out in order to kind of get the information that I want to receive. But I also feel like that's the same that you would have when you're looking for a book or like looking for a journal article, is you have to like figure out the question that you're wanting to ask. It takes time for that.
Yeah, and sometimes you ask the question and you get the answer back and you're like, no, that's not exactly the question I wanted. Yeah. But I think there's so much, like that's such fertile ground when we do those kinds of things, ask the question, get the answer, realize that really wasn't what we were after, reshape the question. It causes us to really clarify what our objective is, or maybe what our values are around something. And so, that sort of wandering, being open to new things, that's the kind of broad openness that in my mind really helps grow us intellectually. And the other thing in his book, one of the other messages I took away from his book, it's almost like being curious makes you more curious. Like curiosity isn't something that drops out of the sky. It's a muscle you have to exercise. And, I know for me, I like always, and, aside from my professional life, I just like to do new stuff. I like to have new hobbies. I mean, oh my God, if you look in my garage, you can see all the hobbies I've done. A million of them. But I think being curious like that outside of your professional life, it feeds your curiosity in your professional life too, because it just becomes this mindset of like, what do I not know about this thing? Or I hear like Rox is doing something and I'm like, oh, what is that all about? Boom, 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 go over there. And so I think it's something that it's a muscle that you build, that you grow, that you rehearse, you exercise it. And I think it gets stronger. And I thought that was an interesting aspect of the book about how curiosity can be cultivated. It's not, it's like the growth mindset thing. Like intelligence isn't something that drops out of the sky. It's something you're constantly working at, shaping, directing. So I liked that aspect of the book also.
That's exactly what was coming up for me as you were talking there, Mary, was the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. Like even the idea of like new information is something that you can find answers to questions you have. Like it's almost like an identity statement in the way that we think about like, facts, feelings, and identities in our courses. Like I'm someone who, if I have a question, I can find the answer to it. It's like, that's a very strong identity statement. And I think some people are that way. Like, and I think probably being encouraged to have a growth mindset throughout your education and your life probably helps you to get you to that place. And I think some people, that's not something that necessarily occurs to them. Like if they don't have a piece of information, there's not a flag waving that says, hey, something's missing here. Right. Like that, it's just like, well, we'll never know. Right. Yeah, that was coming up for me strongly as you were talking there.
Yeah.
That was a big theme that came up for me as well. Well, first of all, like I think the first line that stuck out in the book to me and like still like I could remember it without having to write it down was curiosity is a state, not a trait. And I like that it can be learned and practiced. And I think that's sort of what you were alluding to as well, Mary, is that, it's not something you're born with. Well, although some people, it's so, like some of the examples I gave, it does seem like those people were born with it. But I think for the rest of us, normal folks, not billionaire entrepreneurs, is, it's something that can be practiced and encouraged, I think, from an early age. And it was actually that big section that he had on children that I found a little bit discouraging and upsetting at times. Like I think it is a luxury and a privilege almost to be able to be curious. Like when they were talking about all these studies in children, it's almost like the ones who are safe and supported enough to explore different things were the ones who were curious. And then there became a knowledge gap between them and their peers who maybe weren't as lucky to be supported and encouraged in the same way. And talking about the adults, and so sometimes in the home, these kids who appeared more curious were actually guided by an adult who could facilitate their learning and also who modeled curiosity back to them almost. And that actually made me think, after I was, got over the fact that I was feeling so sad for all these kids. It made me think of some of the best clinical instructors I've had at work. So some of these more senior staff in the department who were, when you would go into their operating room, were always so curious. We're asking you, what are the residents doing these days? What did you learn from that young staff next door who's doing this type of anesthetic or who's doing this type of ultrasound, et cetera, et cetera. It almost seemed like the senior clinicians that I looked up to in terms of thinking that, they're exceptional at what they do and they're usually the most fun to work with, they were simultaneously teachers and learners. They were curious about what you were doing. They were sort of modeling learning for you when you were learning from them. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that I'll take away, moving on in my own career. Now as a fellow, I'm sort of in a funny place where I am both a learner and a teacher. And yeah, hoping to incorporate that in what I do, and also hoping to make that safe environment for learners where I can model that behavior for them and make them feel comfortable enough to ask those questions and to develop their own curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Lauren, I just love that you brought up these excellent points, and I think that makes me think that curiosity is such a core skill for educators. And I think Mary and Roxanne might have heard me ask this in our Healthcare Assimilation Essentials course. Usually on day 2 of the course, I ask the participants to reflect on how curious am I. I used to ask people to share how they rate themselves. It got pretty awkward. Some people, no, to be honest, and I appreciate the honesty, some people say I'm not a curious person at all. And I respect that. I respect that level of reflection. And now I just ask people to keep it private and write it down and reflect on it, 6 months and 1 year from now. I think, Lauren, you are so right. And I agree, the best teachers that I have were curious about knowledge. They're curious about people. What are people doing? What are they thinking? How are they feeling? I think that's the type of curiosity that makes the most difference in the day-to-day work that we actually do, and especially in debriefing and simulation as well. This is such great tension between being curious and knowing. And a lot of times in debriefing, we ask learners to show us that they know stuff. We want to show our learners that we know stuff. But maybe actually the more productive approach is to say we don't know stuff. So I'm going to ask you to really share with me, what were you thinking and what were you feeling? How did it come to these outcomes that you see in sim? So it's kind of a big flip for a lot of people to reflect on how curious am I?
Yeah. I think it's a huge flip, Grace. And especially I think when you're in a position of being faculty, people think that means that everything, or sometimes that, people who I know who are faculty, they put that pressure on themselves. Well, I have to know everything. No, and so it's making me wonder, what is the link between curiosity and vulnerability? Are people who are willing to be vulnerable, are they more curious? I don't know. Never seen any research on that, but it just occurred to me when you were saying that. I think for me personally, there's definitely a connection there, because once I let go of I'm the teacher, so I have to know everything, it became so much easier for me to be curious about what was going on in my learner's mind, because there's the first thing I don't know everything about. But it also made it okay for me to say, you know what, I don't really know that, but we can find out together. So interesting link you brought up there in my brain, Grace. Vulnerability and curiosity.
What I was thinking about was, Jenny Rudolph talking about in her work and some of the work that we do, like cultures of openness and transparency and cultures of silencing. And I was seeing a real parallel with sort of the anecdotes about children and childhood development that were in the book, where, you know, Jenny often talks about in her talks, when we encourage transparency, when we encourage openness and feedback and asking questions and being unsure or being uncertain, we create a culture of being transparent and open. And when we shut that stuff down, when we deny those conversations, when we deny feedback, when we deny speaking up, we create cultures of silencing. And that I was seeing a really strong parallel with the idea that young children, if they're curious about something and they get shut down, that creates a vicious cycle of like, you're not going to be curious anymore because you've been shut down. Like it's the same thing in our adult healthcare culture as with kids.
Well, so interestingly, just like talking about the development of like expertise in like that conversation that we were having about expertise. Yeah, I came across an interesting concept recently that our experts sometimes are using very like reflective, not reflective, reflex-based thinking. So they've developed certain pathways, so subsequently implement certain pathways consistently. And the thing that makes me wonder about that type of processing, and we always get kind of label it as like the type 1 versus type 2 thinking, is like both are prone to error, but having the ability to switch off and think about, okay, when am I going to dive into this a little bit more deeply? And when am I okay with switching into that thinking? And I think it becomes more difficult, as you guys were saying, like as you become more senior in your learning, to say, you know what, I should kind of dive back to first principles and not just use some of those same reflective pathways. And it does take, I think, a bit of humility in order to do that. But I think it shows a lot of insight into how you want to work as a clinician, educator, whatever your field is.
Yeah, one of the things that sparked my attention from Lauren and then James as well is just the importance of the psychological safety. And when that is activated at its best, I think it allows people to be curious and to be vulnerable to not having all the answers and being more willing to listen or to do a little research and look further to other people for help or you know, and as our role as educators, that's something that we need to keep forefront in our mind, is that what our role is in establishing or helping to create that safe container for learning so that our learners can feel more comfortable sharing and learning and asking questions and exploring and having more experiences together. So, you know, I was thinking back to some of my people that have been my senior faculty when I was younger, and, you know, the vast differences between somebody who really fostered more engagement, more openness, allowed me to be more vulnerable, to share my limitations and not be feeling shamed, versus other of my faculty who were much more, I don't know, I want to call it old school, but just more closed, more domineering, you know, had all the answers. And by God, you better have the answers when I ask you my questions. And just such a vast difference of how you respond and how you behave. It's an enormous responsibility when you reflect upon yourself and your role as an educator.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Roxanne, I feel like I've sort of, with what you were just saying and what Will was saying just prior, I feel like I just sort of had like a little loop click closed in my head, which is you know, we in some of our courses in redesigning things like our Dash Raider training course, one of the things that we've been talking about in that redesign process is how do we take people from being novices, take the knowledge that a master of doing this rating, for example, like a master rater of a debriefing, someone who is an expert debriefer can look at a debriefing and go like, this is what was good, this is what needed improvement, this is what, you know, wasn't good. Can just like code that qualitatively instantly in their head. What are the steps from being a novice to being a master? Like something that I say a lot in those meetings is like, what is the path to mastery for the novice? Like, how do you go from A to B to C? And almost what I'm hearing is like, and this is clicking something down in the depths there, the idea that like the greatest masters of an art, or like the greatest teachers of it, are people who can see the problem through the eyes of the novice, or like see the question through the eyes of the novice. You approach it with the eyes of the novice so that you don't fall into, as Will was saying, that automatic version where you're not really questioning yourself or your judgment. And so I feel like that's a loop, right? Like the greatest masters of a thing can see it the way that a novice sees it, and then they can take a novice along the pathway to mastery, and then they'll be able to see it again through the eyes of the novice. There's like a loop happening there that just sort of clicked for me just now.
Yeah, and I was just thinking of another book by Gary Klein called Sources of Power, and he really delves into this notion of, you know, the difference between a novice and an expert and the way that they think. And, you know, the novice proceeds more along a step-by-step. They need that path, they need that guidance, they need that series of that algorithm that they need to take step by step to make the decisions to do X, Y, and Z. And versus the expert who has accumulated this library of experiences and actually can just size up a situation and know what is the right thing to do. But with the caution that Will stated of, you know, not falling into a trap by not questioning your own judgment. And I think there's such a tension there. But Gary Klein studied firefighters and looked at the differences between the way novice firefighters or more newly trained firefighters would size up a situation and determine that a building was going to collapse from the fire and they needed to get out safely, versus the way the more experienced expert commander would size up a situation. And they didn't go through the algorithm. They just really had accumulated such a series of experiences that their library was such that they could get to that decision much quicker and faster. So it's a really interesting thing to contemplate, Will.
Just one point regarding the asking a lot of questions. This is the secret how the people that keep them curious. So this is the as much as you can ask more, you can learn more and more. That the author dig more about this issue in our learning process.
Yeah. You know, it's all those informal learning moments throughout our lives that can become building blocks. It doesn't all happen in school. Yeah. I tell you, I'm going to interact with my grandchildren very differently after reading this book. When they ask me questions, I'm not just going to answer their questions. I'm going to let's dig a little deeper into this.
How could we find that out together? Yeah,
exactly.
So I think it is about time to bring our discussion to a close. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I would encourage everyone to stay curious, do everything you can to nurture your own curiosity, and to do everything you humanly can do to nurture and encourage other people's curiosity as well. And with that, we'll sign off. The CMS Book Club.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.